So my guest today is Dan Martell. So Dan is an angel investor. He's the founder of the SAS Academy, where he trains and coaches high-performing SaaS founders. Before that, Dan founded several technology companies, three of which, Spheric Technologies, Flowtown, and Clarity, were acquired. He raised millions of dollars in funding. He was an advisor to billion-dollar companies like Intercom, Hootsuite, and Udemy, and he's a fellow Canadian. So Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Etienne, thanks for having me, man. I'm super pumped to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
That's great. So maybe start with a big question. So if an entrepreneur were to start a new business tomorrow, how would you recommend they go about doing that, and what would be the starting point?
Dude, that big question freaked me out. I thought it was going to be like, what's the meaning of life? I was like,
the next one.
I was worried I wasn't ready for it. Yeah. So, I mean, here's the way I think about it is the biggest risk of any business or entrepreneurial endeavor is building something for a customer that doesn't want it. And so every company I've ever started, I've always gone to the consumer, to the customer, to the individual first, and then worked backwards from that. The way I do it is pre-selling. And people are like, oh, you can't pre-sell this, you can't pre-sell that. The beauty of today is I've got crowdfunding to just, point to and say, hey, crowdfunding's probably about a $3 or $4 billion a year market, maybe even bigger at this point. And every one of those projects essentially are pre-orders, pre-sales to the product before, for most of them, ever build it, right? They might have a design, they might have a prototype, etc. So the first thing that I have always done in every company is pre-sell it. So maybe some examples will help. When I started my company, Maritime Vacation, my first customer was my dad. He owned a cottage. I thought, he kept getting phone calls from people because he was listing the vacancy on in newspapers. It's hilarious now that I think of it. He ran classifieds, and he kept answering the same questions. Yes, it's available these dates. No, it's not. No, we don't allow pets. It's in this location. It was built 30 years ago. Like literally, I mean, this is 97, 98. So I just asked him if he'd be willing to pay, and I charged him a lot more than everybody else because I needed the money for the servers. But he paid, I charged him $500 or $600 because it was like $100 a month for these servers that I built in this programming language called Cold Fusion. But I pre-sold it to my dad, and then I went as far as pre-selling it to a bunch of bed and breakfasts. So the way I did that is I found a list in every province. There's a tourism guide, and I found out that they have all their addresses in the tourism guide, and I created a mail merge in Word, an access database for the data that I got my little brother Mo to fill in, a Word doc form letter that said, hey, there's this thing called the internet. Do you want to put your bed and breakfast on, and it costs like $30, send me some photos and some cash. And dude, people did it. They sent me money in the mail, and I was 17 at the time. So I've been doing this my whole career. This is 20 years later. I'm 39 now, 20 years later, and I'm still doing this with every company I'm involved in because it's just the fastest way to validate that your idea. And here's the big thing is people disconnect the fact that it's not that the customer may not have the problem. It's just they may not want the solution you're selling. So some people think they're doing customer development or pre-selling by saying, hey, do you have this problem? I'm going to solve it. Pay me money. But what's more interesting to me is I'm going to solve it this way. Do you want that? Because those two things can definitely get you in trouble.
And so how would you adapt that to B2B SaaS, for example? Like you're talking an example that's more B2C. Like if you're looking at B2B specifically.
No, that was B2B. I mean, every one of those vacation, bed and breakfast, those are all business customers, right?
Okay.
It's no different. Same thing. So I coach a ton. I think I've got over 100 coaching clients right now in my SAS Academy program, all incredible B2B SaaS founders. And I would say 60, 70% executed the same playbook. And what's cool is they continue to do it for new product iterations, right? So they'll pre-sell new add-ons, modules, et cetera, and then co-create it with the customer. So the way you do that is you want to essentially create a one pager. So you spec out, problem, solution, features. So let's say 3 core features: product hook, product promise. And then you go and talk to your, what I call a perfect fit customer, right? Your ideal customer profile, your target, whatever you want to call them. But essentially, I think this is the right customer for this solution. And you try to get 10 people to buy. Most people make the mistake at that stage of changing the specs on the product for every conversation. Okay. So if I'm talking to you, Etienne, and you're like, hey, Dan, I love this, but it's missing this feature. If you add it, I'll buy, I'm in, right? And then all of a sudden now you've got 10 new customers and 10 new features to add. And it's essentially professional services. It's not, so what I always tell people is pre-sell based on, because here's the deal is, and again, I've been doing this for so long that I know all the rebuttals. Like, people are going to say, well, my customers are not early adopters, blah, 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 blah. Like, you name it, I'll give you the reason why you got to overcome it, but it can be done. I mean, just the idea of an early adopter, right? If you look at, I think it's Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Yep. I always mix up Jeffrey and Clayton Christensen. I think it's Jeffrey Moore. So Jeffrey Moore wrote, yeah. So essentially the people that, are the early adopters, the innovators, they're willing to invest to have competitive advantages before the rest of the market gets something. And those are the people you actually want to find. Those are the ones that you want to figure out where they're hiding, and they're the ones that are going to be your early adopters and help you co-create the product. And I mean, even one of my mentors, and I can walk you through dozens of examples, but one of my mentors, Marcel Lebrun, another great Canadian, essentially from New Brunswick, built a company called Radian 6. Okay. And they did the exact same thing with Radian 6 for Fortune, really 2,000 customers, right? Where they pre-sold, they co-created, and they built out the product from that point of view.
So I interviewed Alan Clement a couple of weeks back, the author of When Kale and Coffee Compete. And there's a great story in that book on how your team used the jobs to be done framework at Clarity. So what's the role of GTBD, and how do you use it today?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's kind of like, I think it's Bob Moesta, really, who's the pioneer behind it. The idea, first off, going to say, I think Jobs to be Done is probably the worst named framework ever. And I say that with a lot of love and admiration, obviously, because it's not sexy, right? Lean startup is sexy. Agile is sexy. Jobs to be Done is a little flat, right? Yeah, I think if they would have called it, so like, I just always thought, it hasn't got as much prominence as it should because it's so incredibly powerful, and a large part to that is probably some positioning. That being said, the way I think about it, and it's Henry Ford, his whole thing was the job that people wanted was not a faster horse, is they wanted to get to point A to point B faster, right? And in many ways, this is the way Elon Musk thinks when he talks about first principles. Right? When he looks at transportation or rocketry or electric cars, et cetera, he looks at the first principles of physics involved in saying, if this is the job to be done, then how do we really look at reducing the cost and making it a better product? So for me, when I was looking at Clarity, the biggest challenge, and I'll be honest, when I started, I was full of, enthusiasm and excitement, because I was like, wow, I can't believe nobody had thought of this yet, right? Nobody thought, hey, there's all these experts in the world, there's all these micro celebrities. How do we connect them with the people that want their attention? If they obviously have a followership, if you have people following you on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., reading your books, many of them would pay a premium to get on a call to ask you specific questions around their context and get some solutions. So that was the premise for Clarity. Now, when you dive into, total addressable market, specific, what is the job to be done? Here's what I realized. I remember I came across one of my early adopters, a guy named Omar out of Miami, and he spent like $7,000 on Clarity in a week, right? So obviously I was like, okay, I need to figure out what does he believe? What does he know that made him do that ROI calculation and him decide to pull the trigger? Like, I didn't know him. Like, this was kind of the first, not influenced by Dan Martell, don't know their group of friends. Like, he saw the product, understood it, and went nuts and did about, half dozen calls. And the way he framed it for me was, hey man, I used to spend way more money traveling to events, standing in line in a Q&A to ask a question that might get answered that really only got answered high level because it had to be relevant to everybody else. And even if I tried to talk to the speaker after they get off stage, it was hit or miss. And now you let me get access to those same quality of speakers today. I don't have to wait. And for honestly a fraction of the cost that I used to spend going to conferences and events. He goes, I can't believe people don't get that. And that's when I realized that the job to be done, one of the primaries was for a certain type of business owner or entrepreneur that are looking to make strategic decisions that have a belief set that have to be true. I think that this is like when we talk about perfect fit customers, I think if you don't take into consideration the corporation or the individual's values, you're missing a huge opportunity, because what I realize is, entrepreneurs in general, if you grab 100 of them, it's actually only about 20 to 15% that are growth minded, right? And people are like, well, I don't get it. Every entrepreneur is growth minded. No, there's a lot of people that are freelancers, self-employed, et cetera, that are quote unquote entrepreneurs that do not have the same belief, growth, abundance mindset. And so if you take about like that target market and the job to be done, it was really for a growth minded entrepreneur that valued counsel, advice, expertise, that believed that investing in themselves or their team was a good investment. So all of a sudden now that the market size gets a lot smaller, but the beauty is understanding that job to be done allowed me to say, okay, well, what's true about that customer, right? So if I take Omar and I zoom back and I go, okay, what's true about Omar in the context of who he is and his values and his business and et cetera. And we found out some really smart things. One, most Omars use Evernote, right? Which is an obvious thing in hindsight because A, it's an advanced tool back then, right? Most people didn't know about Evernote. B, it showed that you were somebody who collected information, right? Because that's the core premise of Evernote, to just like capture, take your digital bond and put it in a better format. And C, that you believed in kind of investing in yourself and like investing in tools, right? So a lot of people don't invest in tools. They don't invest in a day timer. They don't invest in, simple things, right? Software, project management software, workflow. So that was the big, again, I don't want to waste all, like you get questions, but that was the big thing, is just trying to understand at the core of this, when I call them bright spots in your product, in your customer usage, there's bright spots, people that are getting a disproportionate amount of value out of your product. You need to zoom in, interview, jobs to be done framework, then extract what's true, and then go validate that with your other bright spots to see, is this true there? Can I go and find that on these other companies? And then if those things are true, then how do I use that understanding for positioning and marketing? Okay.
So maybe going to come back to this, but like if we take a step back, so like once the product is out, like how do you start learning from your users? Like how you start learning from the early users?
Lots of different ways. So it's kind of like right time, right action. So that's why I call everything I do growth stacking, because I really believe there's things you do when you're at this stage that's different at this stage, and you kind of stack your growth tactics. But let's say if you're just starting, one of my favorite things is doing Smile and Dial Thursdays. So every Thursday, I would pick at least 8 clients, because not everybody would answer, and I would call new customers. And I would go through a series of questions. I wouldn't even tell them it was the founder, because I felt like the advice was skewed. So if you're the founder of the product, then people don't want to hurt your feelings, don't want to say anything bad. So I would always say, this is John, product manager at Clarity. I noticed you signed up on Monday. Some people would be like, shut up, this is Dan, because they knew me, whatever. It's all good. But then it was really just trying to find out how they heard of you. Because like there's all these things that you need to learn in the early days. It's you want to figure out kind of like what made them sign up, right? What did they understand about the product? Because this is the big thing I've learned is, and this is another strategy that I call the product profit. It's a survey format, but one of the questions you ask is, how do you explain the product to a friend or colleague, right? And if you then filter that answer in the survey to the people that would be very disappointed, so essentially they can no longer use the product, how disappointed would you be? The very disappointed people. Those people have a different description than what you have on your homepage. And I see this 80% of the time. When I start working with a client, we send out the survey, I look at the data, I zoom in on it, I show them, and then I go, okay, here's your homepage, here's what they're saying. Do you see a disconnect? So what happens is the motivated users figure it out, and those are the ones that are very disappointed, and everybody else didn't figure it out because your messaging's off. So that's what I'm always looking for in the early days, is understanding, you know, how did you hear about us? What did they say? How did they explain our product? What did you think you would discover when you signed up? What problem were you looking to solve? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these like product questions, but I do that every week. You know, at least I want to get on at least 3 calls in an hour, and I usually have a queue of 8. So it means you got to get some signups, but that's the way you do it in the early days.
So you're trying to get at the value proposition, like the messaging itself first, and then how that ties to the product, or? All
of the above. I mean, because you have time, you can get through all of that. I think in the early days, usually your product's pretty straightforward. You know, it's almost like a feature. It doesn't do a whole lot. First version of Clarity pretty much was, you know, like you call, that was it. Like there was no Q&A. It was like a handful of experts. There was no marketplace. You know, you couldn't search. It was like, here's some experts on these topics, you know, call them. So it's all the above. It's figuring out, it's all, the way I think about it is there's a mental movie that customers create in their mind, and we want to create that mental movie to tell a story that we want, that is deliberate, that we believe is the best story for them to propagate in the market, right? Like that's the way I think marketing's job is to craft the mental movie around the problem you solve and how you solve it, who you solve it for, and what makes it unique and interesting, and some of the results you've gotten for other clients. And if you do that in a way that uses their words, right? So this is the other thing, just from a copy point of view, you know, some founders will call them, I mean, think about different industries have different words for customer, right? Gyms call them members, doctors call them patients, lawyers call them clients, so just little nuances like that make such a big difference when you're trying to position the product. So trying to figure out the way people describe the product, figure out what problem they're trying to solve, understanding how they wish it would have been solved. So if there's a disconnect between what they expected and what you did, which, you know, goes back to the Kano model, I think it's worth understanding that gap. But to me, it's refining the mental movie and knowing that everything from who first introduces them to the solution, to the homepage, to the sign-up flow, to the first-time user experience, to your retention, re-engagement, emails, et cetera, are all going to hopefully be a thoughtful, consistent, clear, you know, mental movie of the problem you're solving. And I think if you look at the best products in the world, that's what they either did consciously or unconsciously.
So in one of your talks, you were mentioning that you created the customer advisory board for Clarity. And now it really help with validation, features, and all that stuff. So how would you recommend founders think about that specifically, and maybe set it up if that's still something you advise companies to do?
Yeah, so I call it the CAB, Customer Advisory Board, or internally at Clarity, we called it the A-Team. You know, it was essentially our advisory board, our A-Team. I think that depending on the product and the engagement of your A-Team, you might want a dozen people to 25 people. I think at the height, we had probably 30. Because I just keep adding people. So the big mistake people make is letting customers opt in, right? Which I call the vocal minority. I think a lot of times there's very enthusiastic. I mean, this is probably the saddest part about building a company, is when somebody's like, oh my God, I love you. This is so amazing. What a great product. Oh yeah, I love it. It's so great. You're the guy. Oh, that's amazing. And then you go look at their account and they haven't done anything. They've never used it. They signed up once 6 months ago. You know, which is not horrible because they're out there being an advocate and an ambassador, but you know, they really, if you actually got their feedback, because a lot of these vocal minorities will tell you stuff like, you know, what you're missing is you got to add a bookmarklet, or you got to add a mobile app, or you got to add integration with this tool, and they're actually not users. So that's the big thing for me is step one, you decide who you think would be a great person to add to the customer advisory board. And then the way you engage them, to me, I think is, and even though, so clickable prototypes is a kind of a concept that I'm a big fan of, both in pre-selling and in product development. So a lot of people do the clickable prototypes to validate their idea, to get pre-orders, et cetera. And then they stop doing it when it comes to product development, which I think is the hugest opportunity, right? I remember one time we were working on a browser extension for Clarity, and I was showing it. I built the clickable prototype, which is super simple. Like, you can use Balsamiq, you can use UXPin. You know, if you want to get fancy, you can go to Envision app. We use Keynote. We literally built a design template style guide in Keynote with all the widgets and all the tools and the interfaces for our product. Our designer built it. And then anybody on the team could literally just take the templates, retweak things, and easily create a new flow. So I was working on the browser extension for Chrome, and I showed it to some customers, and they just said simple things like, that doesn't make sense. The language you used on that page, the way you asked me to add it to my browser, just doesn't make sense. Or when you did this, I expected to see that, and you're showing me these little blue dots, but that doesn't tell me that I can call the expert. You should change it to this. So like, being able to use your customer advisory board for product design pre-building, I think is so incredibly invaluable, because they'll allow you to come out of the gate with a new feature module that's way more polished and on point than if you just, build it and deploy it. So that's how I use them. And it was really just for focus groups as well. So like, I'm a big fan of actually going into a customer's world and watching the way they work, right? So with Clarity, for example, one of the big features that we never got to build that we were going to release was integration into calendars. So one thing that we believed is, as the jobs to be done, was expert advice for your team. And most of those conversations happen in a meeting with 2+ people around things that they've never done before. Like, we're going to work on our SEO or marketing, or, I'm thinking of bringing on a VP of sales or whatever it is, right? And they have these calendar invites, and I wanted to make it seamless so that it would prompt you and say, do you want an expert for this call, right? And then give you 3 options, and you could say, yep. And then it would just, like, it's a pretty straightforward. So where was I going with that? Oh, showing the customers how that would work, and getting their feedback around how they think of advice today, and what advice that they would feel comfortable allowing their team to pull from. Because that's when it got really interesting, when it moved away from just being the entrepreneur, and then it being the team that had a budget essentially for expert advice, and really trying to understand the team's approach or mentality to it, because some team members felt attacked, or they were worried that they would look like they didn't know what they were talking about if they brought in an expert, right? Because they were paid $125,000 a year to manage marketing, and all of a sudden now they're spending $500 an hour to bring in an expert. They were worried that if they did that, their boss, the CEO, the founder, would think, well, they don't know what they're doing, right? So just even understand that nuance. I don't think I would have came to on my own, because our culture was totally different. I gave everybody on the team a $500 budget to do Clarity calls individually. Every person on the team should and could make calls to help their betterment. So that's the way I think of using a customer advisory board to essentially validate early, when there's not a lot of invested cost on ideas, to quick, because it's all about speed, right? If I have to go and create a survey structure and find people to take it, et cetera, versus if I already got this group ready to go. And then we would even do like pre-releases, made them feel special, maybe mention them in the release if they helped kind of guide the shape, the feature, et cetera.
So how do the techniques you use and the insights that you look for evolve as the business grows? Like, now you're talking about the customer advisory board. You're talking before you're doing all these interviews. Like, does that remain, or do you change the way you learn and the way you adapt?
It moves. What happens, if you think about it, it's qualitative versus quantitative, right? So you got these 2 ends of the spectrum. And I think in the early days, let's call it 0 to 100 million, or 100 million, 0 to million in ARR, annual recurring revenue, $83K a month in revenue for B2B SaaS. A lot of that is going to be qualitative, working with the customers, talking to the customers, watching them work, right? One question I love to ask customers is, what do you do 3 minutes before or 3 minutes after you use our product, right? To really get an understanding of what I call share of wallet. How do I get more of the full problem space that they're looking to solve in our solution, et cetera? And that is very qualitative in the early days, right? And then later on, million plus, 2, 3, 4 million. Now it's more data, analytics, surveys, et cetera, because you have a bigger pool of customers. So if you could in the early days, it'd be great to do that stuff, but you just don't. So it moves to more split testing, NPS scores, just engagement data, right? So like when we work on product features, I use the RICE scoring concept, which is reach, impact, confidence, and ease. And being able to then like get the data of like, okay, we have 500, and then segmenting out by like, by plan. So the other thing is a lot of people, they look at retention as like this global number, but to me, it's like, you got to separate the small versus the medium versus the large churn numbers, because they're different customers, they're different appropriate experiences, they're different expected outcomes. And then once you've got that, then you can use the surveys to dive in and look at things like pricing would be like willingness to pay, right? So I just feel like that's the way to think about it, is that early days, it should be very like, to me, the founder should be in the support tickets. Like there's some gold in there. I did support for 2 years at Clarity, the first 2 years. And, again, under a pseudonym name, because obviously if you're the founder, it sounds romantic and people are like, oh, I'm going to do it as a founder. But the truth is that it clouds and it muddies up the feedback. And you know what I mean? People, if it's Jason at 37 Signals, my email to him is going to be different than Sarah, customer support specialist.
Yeah.
So.
And today, like, how do you recommend that founders prioritize features or functionality groups by the value or by what brings most value to the user base?
Well, that's using the RICE score. So there's like a few things, right? Because it's one part of it is, I remember Sean Ellis, who created the term growth hacker. He said, if all we did was split test everything, we'd end up at porn, and I've never forgot that, because it's just a simple idea of like, we can't always look to just optimize the local maxima problem, right? Yeah. So, sometimes the big opportunity requires us to go down the valley and rebuild to get to this next level peak in opportunity. So I think it's using the RICE score, right? Reach, impact, confidence, ease. And that's for, I think, for existing customer bases, but you should also still have a product vision. And my rule and the underlying question I'm asking myself and the team always is, how do we create more value for our customer than anybody else in the world? And if we are always trying to answer that question from a product experience to a customer experience to a marketing experience, I think that it's a good true North Star. And that I think can't be forgotten in light of like, we can make the product better. That's great. But at a certain point, we need to bring innovation to this market. We need to be thought leaders. We need to be pushing the innovation. If all we do, like if Slack stopped at just chat and didn't add other features, if Dropbox just stopped at file storage, et cetera, as they get more competitors out there, then those people are going to be the innovators. So it's kind of like a two-headed thing where you need to make sure the product keeps getting better for your install base, but then you also need to be looking at where's this market going, what's true in the culture, what's changing, and I look at Snapchat as just an incredibly innovative company, right? I mean, if everything you build is being ripped off by Facebook, or Instagram, like you're doing some really smart things. And so I think that's the way I think about kind of prioritization is, yes, using improvements, but also we need to have an eye on the vision.
Okay. And are there, like, in your opinion, like some customer research techniques that you think more business should be using, like those that are maybe neglected by SaaS founders?
Well, I mean, I don't think SaaS founders are doing jobs to be done. So that's a big one. The Kano model, I thought, was just a fascinating way to think about, the customer needs, right? So, and this came from my buddy Merv. He worked in a manufacturing business for years. It's kind of more old school, but the idea that there's kind of three things that we need to focus on is the 3 E's of the Kano models is expected. So what are the things the customer expected? What are the things that they've expressed? So this might be in your support tickets, in your interviews, in your conversations, or even in public chat. So or public support groups. So one of my favorite things to do is go read the Q&A on my competitors' public Q&A chat sites. if they exist, which for the most part they kind of do, or even community forums, right? To really understand, where the gaps are in the market. And then 3 is excite, right? Which is back to that question, how do we create a product that adds more value to our customers than anybody else in the world? Because in answering that, I think we're going to find those opportunities to excite the customer. And that's why, creating those surprise and delight moments, I think, are what separates the brands like a MailChimp to, FreshBooks, sending birthday cakes, like just these simple things that are just so powerful when it comes to retention, loyalty, and word of mouth marketing. And that whole VWAM is what I call the virtual word of mouth marketing. Like, it's more prevalent than ever. I mean, especially with like sites like Capterra and others, like your ability to get new customers from a positive customer experience is exponential, and it continues to get better, right? Review sites, distribution channels, your mobile reviews, your Google reviews, Glassdoor for your employee reviews. I mean, it's pretty neat that if you can do things that are just better than everybody else and get recognized for that, it has such an exponential impact to your growth.
Maybe the reverse, like are there some techniques that you think less businesses should be using, like some that are overrated that people use, or things that people do that are not worth it or not as important?
My biggest pet peeve is people hiding behind their data. Okay. So that's like my biggest pet peeve. Yeah. So the way I think about it is, super early on for sure they're doing it. And even later on, I mean, here's the way I think about it. If I have a retail store and I own that retail store and I hide in the back, in the closet, and around me is like these closed circuit televisions, and I'm watching our customers come through the front door and they're interacting with staff, and I'm just like spying on them essentially. I'm just watching, as they come in and the customer says, do you need any help with anything? And they're like, no, I'm fine. They're like, okay. Or, and you just spy on them and then they leave without buying, right? And a lot of these tech founders, they just sit in this friggin' room and watch these TVs and see things happening and never once, like, dude, if I owned the retail store that sold jeans and people walked in and left without buying, and like 3 or 4 people did that in a row, I would run out after them and apologize for friggin' being out of breath and saying, hey, I just got to ask you, you came into the store, so you were looking for something or you were interested in something. What was missing, or what were you expecting? Back to the Kano model, right? Expected. Because if I don't solve that day, like, it doesn't get better day 2, 3, 4. So I just think a lot of founders get really giddy on their profit well, or their barometrics, or their chart moguls, or their, whatever segment data. And they don't actually stop and say, those are people behind those emails, they're data points. And if I see a behavior, I should engage. So like when we built the product called Timely, and our activation was like 10%. It was super low from what we expected, because it was a simple tool to let you auto schedule your tweets so that they would be published in the best time to amplify based on your audience, right? So we look at the data and we'd say, you don't have to tell us when to schedule it. We'll schedule it for you. Just queue them up. And people weren't using it. And I didn't sit there and try to fix it and try to guess. I picked up the phone and I emailed them and said, hey, John, I know you signed up for Timely. You got 5 minutes, or you got 3 minutes. Here's my cell. Text me. Like, I just want to get on a call. And the craziest thing happened. They all kept saying, this is amazing. I love the idea. I signed up, but I've queued it up. I'm going to look at it next week, or I'll look at it tonight, or I'll look. So they didn't take the action at the beginning. And then I realized that the big reason was they had nothing to tweet. So what I changed is essentially I gave them a prompt. I thought, what's the most universal types of tweets that I could present for them to add, so that if they don't publish a tweet through Timely, they're never going to come back, because we never show them the core value. We never get them that aha moment. And we showed them quotes, motivational quotes. It wasn't for everybody, but they were pretty generic, pretty straightforward, that they thought, oh, okay, I could share this. And then they would just add it to the queue and it would tweet, but then they would get the email and it'd say, oh, this quote. And the cool thing is quotes get a lot more engagement than most people's, personal life tweets or content share. So it was just a way for us to say, like, oh shit, this tweet got 5 retweets. My tweets never get retweets, and then they're like, I got to go use Timely. So it's those little things that if you don't talk to the customer, you might just look at the data and think there's something wrong with the product, and there is, but the real insights is going to be from the conversation. So I'm just not a fan of hiding behind the data. And that's the thing I think people need to stop doing.
But why do you feel like founders are, like some of them are afraid to do that? Like, is it fear, or is it like, what do you feel is the reason?
Yeah, I think it's fear to have somebody criticize their product.
Okay.
I get it. I'm the same way, man. I don't want to hear, I already know it's broken with the product. I already know that it's not great. I'm having a hard time getting out of bed just to keep building and grinding because I'm not getting paid, and it's, like the revenue didn't happen the way, like, I get it. It's hard. It's like, it's like lining up to get kicked in the stomach, but if you know that the opportunities on the other side of that activity, you gotta have the faith and push forward.
Maybe last question. So like, if we try to put everything back together, like, so I'm a subscriber of your newsletter. There's a lot of great content there, but also I've noticed there's a lot of experiments. How do you go about validating and iterating the SAS Academy, like your current business? Like, how do you go about experimenting, testing, growing?
I pretty much everything I've just told you, I do for my coaching business. Okay. So I have a customer advisory board. I measure everything. I'm interviewing the customers. We get surveys, we get NPS scores, we get feedback. Every event we do a post-event survey at the event so that there's 100% completion. My customer success person is continuously monitoring and getting feedback. We have a process for doing that. So my marketing team, same thing. They're continuously split testing. We're coming up with ideas every quarter to kind of say, hey, let's try this positioning. Let's try this messaging. Let's try this email format. So I don't know, like, to me, I've always just loved, so with SAS Academy, essentially it's not a subscription, there's a commitment. So it's a 3-year program with a 1-year commitment. But I let people, pay it off every month. And I just love that. I've always loved business models. And that's why I fell in love with software that were just predictable, right? And because they're predictable every month, they're predictable in the sense that they pay every month. And because of that, every month I need to earn that investment, right? Because I think every time I pay $89 for Trello or $250 for my email marketing tool or, $100 a month for Slack or whatever it is, I'm asking myself, did I get that kind of value out of the product? And I just love that honesty and purity of that exchange. And I think that, sometimes enterprise products don't get that. They don't get that alignment. And I just think it's just such a beautiful thing that I can't think of a business that I'll ever get involved in that doesn't have a subscription model. Even like some of my clients, they pre-sell 2-year contracts, which is a great way to bootstrap up front. It's very dangerous in the future. So again, right time, right action. In the early days, great way for cash flow. If you're 3 or 4 years in, 2 to 3 million in AR, it's actually really bad for you because you're not getting the data set that you should be getting. You're not monetizing as properly too. Because if you've got good retention, why would you give a discount? Just, so there's all these things that, to me, I just love the purity of it. And SAS Academy, I treat it like a software business, and I do all of the stuff we just talked about with my clients because I also don't want to be a hypocrite. I think a lot of coaches out there are. That's just a fact. I'm just going to say this, Etienne. Most business coaches never ask their customers for their financial numbers. I posted that one day. I asked, does your business coach ask you for your P&L? Like your financial numbers? Do they ask on a monthly basis? Does your business coach and review it with you to help you understand it? Everybody, no, yes, no. Like 90% was no. I don't know, man. If you're a business coach and you don't truly understand the person's, like, to me, the financial numbers is the scorecard. It's the scoreboard. It's like all this other stuff that, the playing entrepreneur and doing fun things and feeling motivated and inspired. All this stuff is great, but if it doesn't translate into increased gross margin and, retention and all these other metrics that are going to show up in the P&L, then they don't matter. So, I just have a really hard time when I see, like, I do what I teach, and that's just a personal thing from an integrity point of view. I think it's really weird. It's like I say, you shouldn't trust a fat life coach. And I'm cool saying that, even though it frustrates a lot of people, but it's like, dude, if you can't get your shit together, like, go start there. Like, that's just my thing, is start with your own stuff. And then if you feel compelled, like I've done, to share with others, then that's cool. Right. But, again, that's, I also believe some people are researcher experts and they, blah, 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 blah. I get it. There's always exceptions, but the norm, for the most part, that's how I think about it.
Thanks for taking the time, Dan. It's really appreciated. Where can people go to learn more about your work?
Yeah. So if people have retention issues, because most people do, just go to danmartell.com/churnbuster, and I'll share with you guys my Churnbuster cheat sheet. It's 9 different strategies to increase your retention and really monitor your customers. And then on my YouTube channel, I publish every Monday for the last 3.5 years. So I've got hundreds of videos there. And if you want to see the behind the scenes, like these folks here on Instagram, because I've been live streaming, just follow me on Instagram. It's kind of where I share my journey, the deals I work on, my client stories, my team, my family stuff. It's kind of like the behind the scenes.
Perfect. So we'll share your link as well. Thanks for taking the time. That's really, really appreciated.
Tian, thanks so much, man.
Thank you. Bye.